Okay. Well, we're a couple minutes past 12 and we're ready to start this session. I'm excited today to have you all here. So welcome. You've actually joined the session, Climate Communication, a conversation with honorary member Andrew Revkin. So thank you for joining us. I'm Jamie Vernon, Executive Director and CEO of Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Honor Society, and publisher of American Scientist magazine. I'd like to talk a little bit about what it means to be an honorary member. And honorary membership in Sigma Xi is a category of membership initiated by the Society in 1983. It's a distinction made possible to honor individuals who've served science or the society in a manner or a degree that merits such a recognition, but who come from fields or backgrounds outside the normal criteria for being a member of the Society of Sigma Xi. It's a lifelong distinction. So once you're an honorary member, you're always an honorary member, and it comes with all the benefits of membership in the society. And not more than 2 individuals can be nominated for honorary membership in any single year. This year, Sigma Xi elected 2 honorary members, Andrew Revkin and Juliet Eilperin, both accomplished journalists. And I'm thrilled to have this opportunity today to speak with Andy Revkin. And if you have questions for Andy as we move through the discussion today, please post them in the Q&A, and I will try and bring them into the conversation as they apply or as we have time. But first, I'd like to introduce Andrew. So Andrew Revkin is one of the most honored, experienced, and innovative journalists focused on environmental and human sustainability. And in 2019, he became the founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. And in that role, he builds programs, tools, and collaborations aimed at bridging gaps between science and society to cut climate risk and spread social and ecological resilience. Andy has written on global environmental change and risk for more than 35 years, mostly for the New York Times, and reporting from the North Pole to the White House, the Amazon rainforest to the Vatican. Welcome and congratulations, Andy.
It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be inducted or added to this luminous lineage you've created with these honorary positions.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you. And, the first time you and I met was nearly 10 years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago, when I helped organize the Science Online Climate Conference in Washington, D.C. And at that conference, you gave a great talk about climate journalism, and you sang one of your songs about climate change. So are you still writing songs about the environment?
I haven't written a new song in a while. I've been too busy building the program at Columbia, running my webcasts and writing. But I'm in I have a band, Breakneck Ridge Review, and every Sunday through the COVID lockdown, I was doing a music show on Sunday mornings. I still am doing that, including this Sunday morning. So that keeps me going.
Yeah, and you post those on Facebook? Is that where you do the live, or is it linked?
They're live. They go to LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and it's just a really fun. Yeah. I'll post a link where people can see them. And again, it's kept me. It actually reflects a lot of the wonder part of the communication revolution that we're under, because I've had musicians on from Zambia, from the UK, from people from all around the world can convene, obviously, simultaneously. And we even recorded some songs with people in Zambia and Massachusetts. And so it's great.
Yeah, it's amazing what technology is making possible. I've dropped in on a few of those and enjoyed not just the music, but the conversations you have in between and just the bonding that's clear between the musicians and the folks who are attending.
Yep.
But before we get into the discussion about climate communications, I really want to give you a chance to respond to your election as an honorary member of Sigma Xi. We're pleased, obviously, to be able to recognize your work in environmental journalism. There's a synergy between the scientific community and the journalistic community. Science relies on journalists to inform the public about what research tells us about the university, and journalists rely on scientists to provide accurate and reliable information about the universe. And this recognition of your work specifically speaks to the honest and objective way with which you approach it. So how do you feel about being recognized by a scientific honor society?
I think I like it. It's an interesting relationship. Always, we historically, journalists and their sources are distinct, separate universes. That's kind of changing in this. Even the last few years, colleagues, people I've known who work at ProPublica and the New York Times have been working on new ways to tell stories where scientists are actually in the newsroom, helping sift data. The recent efforts looking at COVID-19 patterns and global warming. There was a great piece the New York Times did showing with data patterns of extreme heat in cities and historical patterns that showed you why Black people tended to live in areas that are more subject to heat. And that's not just reporting on the paper, but they actually, carefully worked with the scientists to present the work. So that there is a relationship that develops over time, and over 35 years of time, these relationships become lifelong. I've known there were key scientists in climate change who I got to know in the 80s. Jim Hansen. Some of them have left this planet. Jim Hansen is still here, but Steve Schneider is gone, and others too. So you develop a fluency and relationships that transcend the traditional source news relationship.
It's interesting that you mentioned the heat island effect, and that's actually been, I use that example as the basis for why Sigma Xi has organized something called SciComm Make, which is bringing scientists and artists and science communicators together to develop funded projects for science communication. We're actually kicking off that event. It's called Communicating Just Climate Solutions, and that starts on Sunday of this conference. So maybe others are interested in that. But we've come a long way in the time that you've been working in journalism, and it's amazing that a lot of things have changed, but a lot of things have remained the same. And science is telling us that the world is really headed toward untold change due to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You've covered this for all these years. So why do you think that we haven't been able to adequately address this issue? And what is journalism, what's journalism's role in helping humanity find and implement solutions to climate change?
Well, there's a piece I wrote a few years back that tells the 30-year part of my journey, and it gets to something you just said a minute ago too, the importance of integrating not just the physical natural sciences, but the social sciences, behavioral science. I had been writing about climate change, 2 books related to it from 1988 through about 2006, before I think I've really, the first time I interviewed a social scientist was in 2006. And she told me some really sobering things about how information does and does not change what people do or what society does. And as a journalist, it was kind of an existential moment. And I know a lot of my scientist friends go through the same process of learning that this isn't like a bucket you fill. Society is not a bucket that you fill with information and that magically becomes the way you are. And, so that took me 18 years of my journalism to realize that. And that's when I shifted to focusing more on not just storytelling. What I did in the old days was really many variations of my first article on global warming, 1988.
Yeah.
Me reporting a lot of stuff, telling you, hey, you should worry about this. That was a model. When I talk to young journalists, I say, don't do more of this. That's not going to change people. You have to understand how to build relationships with audiences, how to have a conversation with your audience, how to know that there's no single audience now. You have policymakers, you have people with different cultural values come at the same story in different ways. And so engaging, listening, journalists claim to listen. We're sitting there listening and writing on pads. But most often, historically, when we were doing that, it was to get the good quote. It wasn't to actually dig in on why a person holds some belief or to have a deeper listening. And that process is so different than the old model. And my entity, what I'm doing at Columbia, is really about hosting, shaping, facilitating exchange of information, sometimes actually between disciplines too. as you know, physics
Yeah.
and sociology don't talk very much to each other, so that we can come out with these more cogent and impactful ways to share knowledge. That's a big change.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioning the interdisciplinarity of physicists coming together with social scientists, and that's really a big part of Sigma Xi. We really consider ourselves to be a host of interdisciplinary communications. And as a journalist, it's interesting to me. You talk to physicists, you talk to social scientists, and obviously you talk to climate scientists. So how do you consider yourself at this point an expert in climate science?
That's a good one. No, I don't know the statistical. I don't have the statistics skill set to say what's a good model or what's a flawed model, but I know who to ask, and I know the thing that I've had the pleasure and honor of doing as a journalist on this beat for so long is interrogating every facet of the climate question. Yeah. I've been to the North Pole. I've been on the sea ice with oceanographers and climate scientists at the North Pole. I've been in the leading model supercomputer centers in Boulder, and I've been to the Vatican to report on the ethical and moral questions around climate change. I've been to slums in India and Kenya where people have no adequate energy, and for them, a fossil fuel is actually a really good thing. Mm-hmm. So I've seen it all, and I've been in demonstrations and in climate talks like the ones that are going on right now in Montreal in 2005 with sort of the class of 2005. Those kids, many of them are now activists or professionals. They've moved forward in careers that are potentially changing the climate for the better. So having that sweep allows me to do what one of my favorite scientists ever, who I got to spend time with, is Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist Nobel winner at Santa Fe Institute. We were hanging out, and he talks about what he calls he has this had this acronym CLAW, crude look at the whole. Yeah. When you're facing complexity with pockets of deep uncertainty and things that are powerfully known, you have to step back and take a crude look at the whole, and that's what can illuminate patterns that you might miss if you're too focused on one niche. And I wake up every day somewhat with that hanging in my head as a way. That's the kind of the power I can bring to this. Yeah, that's great. And I know that you've established, you're a founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia, and you touched on this briefly, but how do you articulate the goals and the purpose of the initiative, and what do you hope to accomplish there? It has two basic layers. One is internal. Columbia is building a climate school. It's like the first new school at Columbia in 25 years. It essentially sprawls into everything from the humanities and arts to law and engineering and, of course, energy policy and Lamont Doherty's Earth Observatory, all that great basic climate and ocean science. And so I've tried to spur and develop an internal network so that you can develop some fluency across these disciplines and practices. And the other part, of course, is an outward approach. How do we build a relationship, as I was saying earlier, between the disciplines and practitioners and communities, especially communities most at risk from these phenomenal unfolding human-generated jolts to the Earth system. And in all that, it's people think about most funders, most politicians, most of us in life, we think about outcomes like a good story or a new law. The climate problems have this dimensionality where you can't really know how you're going to reach the target, but you do know what properties and characteristics you can foster in people and in systems that can raise the prospects you're heading in the right direction. And so that's what I do. It's hard for me to write a note to a funder saying, hey, look what we did last year. And I can say we had 1 million views of my Sustain What webcast, which is true. But that's, to me, not really the measure of success. It's just being on a journey and knowing what aspects of what you're doing take you in the right direction, is sort of a different way of approaching this challenge. That's what I do at Columbia.
Yeah. So I've heard you sort of summarize some of the work that you're doing there. Maybe the public facing perspective of this is trying to make information matter. And how do we make information matter? Because you've talked about it's not filling up a bucket. It's something else. It's engaging in a different way. How do we do that? How do we make it matter?
Well, it's it's a sequential, iterative, and repetitive process of going with what you know at the time, always interrogating, well, what's the actual outcome I'm looking for in the world? And this is like one of the biggest mistakes I think I've made personally, and I think we're still making it in a very big way about climate, is we haven't focused on climate risk nearly enough. By focusing on climate change, that makes the story about the science of climate change, greenhouse gases, all the stuff that I wrote about in here. Climate risk, any one of your listeners, any one of your Sigma Psi members who is involved with disaster risk reduction or policy knows that risk is a formula. Risk equals the hazard times how many people are in the harm's way, exposure, and with factored in vulnerability. And that means that this idea that we're all in this together is fantasy. There are people on this planet who are deeply vulnerable to climate change right now, or to today's climate risks. And the factors driving climate threats to people often are on the ground where we build. This is true from the rich places in California to the poorest places in Nairobi slums, or the floodplains where Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines 2014. Why are people in harm's way? And what can you do to get them out of harm's way? You have to slow global warming, but you have to look at the things around you right now. So the prime story with climate going forward for me always is putting risk in the foreground. Yeah. And then everything crystallizes in ways that are actionable. And that, this idea that grand stories about the climate crisis is going to change us, or, some 100 signatory letter from the National Academy of Medicine on climate and health. They did one of those a week ago, and it's okay, but that is not determinative. That is not what this is about. Focus on what you do best in climate and health science, which is look at the symptoms, but get down to the prime causes and then work on those. And diagnosis, observation, repeat, test, recognize failure, move forward. This is a process of the century, not a process of the next 5 years in life.
Yeah, it creates a challenge. I think COVID-19 really revealed that if scientists felt motivated to get out there and engage the public, it was, I don't think they felt that their research was enough and that they were the experts. We had a crisis on our hands, and the public needed to hear from the experts. And there's been a tremendous effort in recent years to get scientists to step out of the lab and engage the public. In some cases they're trained, in some cases they're not, and obviously that has impacts. What do you think about, is it wise for scientists to be engaging the public directly?
Yeah, it's like with journalists, everyone has a different strength and a different skill set, and not every scientist should be on social media, right, for example. But those who are there, I think, and I've written a ton about this when I was doing my .earth blog at the New York Times. Richard Somerville, who was a Scripps scientist, I posted his piece of explaining how he became an activist, or why he thought it was appropriate to be in the public sphere. And every time when I was examining this question, the key way to do this that sustains your integrity as a scientist or as a journalist is to talk in two sentences. Mm-hmm. I am a hydrologist. I study changes in Earth's water flows. I'm very concerned about what I see about the patterns in the West. We're heading into a mega drought. I'm also a voter and a parent, and I feel that we need to spend much more money than we're doing on X. But by doing it in two pieces, you're helping the audience understand that you're not marketing your expertise when you're giving a position on something like carbon tax, which is outside your expertise. Right. If you're a hydrologist, you could have a view on carbon tax, but don't imply that your hydrology somehow gives you more weight in a conversation in the country about policy, but as a voter, as someone who has an understanding of basic issues, yeah, you can do that. So just talk in 2 sentences. There's a 2-sentence rule I've talked about before.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a session earlier today where Dominic Broussard from the University of Wisconsin-Madison was talking about this very issue, scientists using their authority across disciplines where they're not necessarily the expertise. So you're absolutely right in that. I want to bring in a question from one of the audience members that relates maybe a few minutes ago what we were saying. So the US EPA and related agencies provide guidance to the public on where to seek assistance as part of the environmental justice movement. Do you see the concept of victims of climate change gaining traction politically in the US or elsewhere in the world?
Well, this is a huge issue right now in Copenhagen. That was 2009.
That's a few
in
years
Glasgow.
back.
Yeah, no, I lived there for weeks.
Right.
No, it's a huge issue, and it's a foundational issue in the Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1992. Essentially, the world has three groups right now. There's rich countries that spent 200 years pouring out fossil generated emissions of greenhouse gases. There's emerging giants like India and China. And then there's this massive countries, the least developed countries, that have contributed nothing to climate change and are the ones most in harm's way. So this justice question is a profound part of the treaty process. This next week, anyone who's keeping track, that's a process that could make or break COP26 in terms of people walking out. And the gap there, I just wrote about I'm writing right today about the adaptation gap, the lack of finance flowing from rich to poor countries to facilitate sustainable development and resilience. It's a huge gap. No one's serious about filling it, and that's a problem. Domestically, it's kind of a similar issue, but this is the same as it has been for other pollutants. It's clear from the work of Robert Bullard and many others that pollution there's a racist element in the history of who's most exposed to pollution in most times, and how you repair that going forward is a tough question for science policy politics, but it's definitely a question to be asking and having really conversations about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched it very much is, and like I said, Sigma Xi SciComm Make on Sunday is going to be bringing together scientists to put together projects to think about this victims of climate change. You mentioned COP26, which is happening in Glasgow now. There's some news, a variety of formats, good and bad, about what's happening there, and you probably have the latest insight into what is coming out of COP26. What do you expect? Is there any reason for optimism?
I think there is. It sounds silly to say that, given the gap between the emissions gap. There's lots of gaps, which the UNEP put out a report on, as they do every year. But there's several things, most of which are not at the COP. These meetings are punctuation marks in a long-running sentence, which is our 100-year shift in our relationship with the climate system and with energy. And one thing I learned that I hope everyone understands about the COP process is it mostly is memorializing what countries are doing more than determining what they're going to do. Countries, still 196 countries are signatories. Their primary interest is their local, national imperatives, which are flavored and shaped by cultural realities, by political realities, by geography, by history. And the process now that came out of the Paris talks in 2015 recognizes that the treaty process is more of a nudgy. Oh, sorry, my camera just turned off. It does this sometimes.
Timed out.
Oops, hold on. It's funny. I don't know. Oh, that's so weird. I might have to switch to my other camera. Oh my gosh, why is this happening? Give me a second.
Okay, sure.
I'm going to try it one more time.
I have a couple of questions in here that I'll look through.
I guess it looks like I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Yeah.
Sorry about that. So things to look for. The things that are happening are around, you see these sectoral conversations. There's been an agreement on methane, an agreement on steel, getting the carbon emissions out of steel production. Those side discussions are really based on ongoing sectoral negotiation and collaboration, and fostering that process. The external processes are what allow countries to come to Glasgow or to COP36 or COP46 to report on what's happening. And so facilitating those capacities is the way to generate success at these negotiations. They're not determinative. Anyone who's thinking there's going to be some gavel, there'll be a gavel drop, but it's not like none of that really was negotiated on the ground at these events. It's really based on what you can do domestically within a country to drive progress.
Yeah. Driving progress is obviously a challenge. We have a couple of questions that touch on, issues of communicating with sort of the anti-climate action community. We have a problem of misinformation. We have tech platforms that are not filtering or providing the protections, I think, that we need from misinformation. We've talked, I think, in detail about what's being done to communicate climate science well, but what are your thoughts on the misinformation that's out there and the major platforms that make it? I know that's a tough question, but it is there, right?
Yeah, and of course this transcends climate. It's right. We're in an information emergency, I think, right now. We really are. I've touched on this last year in some of my webcasts that the disruption. There were some people who predicted the internet was breakable, but I think the scope of it hadn't really been absorbed. Facebook, the column I'm doing now is funded by Facebook. I just started on that this summer. I'm thinking whatever I can do within that universe to provide trustworthy conversation and information is worth trying. Google, everyone has a lot of work to do. And most of it, though, comes back to what we've learned from the social sciences, which is that we have these behavioral patterns as people. We are attracted and sucked into things that aggravate us or validate us. And right now, the algorithms are all designed to do both of those things. It's not just the filter bubble. It's worse.
Yeah.
It's dragging you in using the lowest parts of you, as Jaron Lanier wrote in his book. Jaron had this book of 10 reasons to turn off all your devices or something several years ago. I disagree with him on that. I think recognize those things, but don't turn off, because if those who are well-meaning turn off, then QAnon will keep expanding its insane, waiting for John F. Kennedy Jr. to show up in Dallas. And it's very disturbing.
Yeah, it's disturbing.
And we've seen it. I've lived with it. I have relatives who, and my wife Lisa too. In Maine, her relatives became very divided over COVID-19, and some of those that power is really disturbing. And then when you put that against an issue like climate change, there are ways forward. Usually, almost always, even with all this storminess, the things that seem to work out in the end are personal interaction. A friend of mine, Reggie Harris, who's a musician, he was on one of these shows that's a mix of science and music. He was at a protest up in upstate New York and rural New York on a town green. It was a BLM protest, Black Lives Matter. On the same green, there was a MAGA protest, and they had their signs. And he and this guy from the MAGA universe got into a bit of a discussion.
Yeah,
Reggie's Black, and the other guy was white. And like 2/3 of the way, there, 5 minutes in, Reggie suddenly stopped. He felt his own emotions rising. He said, and he stopped and he said, "My name's Reggie. What's yours?" And he paused. He waited, and then the guy told him his name, and they started to talk as human beings. They put away their placards and their badges, their sort of emotion badges, and they were able to, that didn't solve world peace. That didn't, they go back home, but it showed to me the potential that exists in restoring some of that human-to-human contact as a path forward.
Yeah,
it's hard to do on this platform, obviously, but
that's right. Yeah, and
vital
it's
to
hard to
try.
do in social media where people don't feel encumbered by their normal inhibitions. But you touched on
Yeah.
music, and we're here at the end of this session. I would love to welcome you to play us out, if you will. And while you're getting prepared for that, I'd just like to say thank you and congratulations. We're so excited. I think this conversation is indicative of why you've been recognized as an honorary member of Sigma Xi. And if you would, we welcome a song from you on climate or environment.
Yeah, it's so funny. This song I wrote in the early 2000s. It's called Liberated Carbon. It's quick and fun. So let's see if this will work out. It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Then someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, baby, it's the human way. Now I got peat, swamp, fossils running my TV. BP's Black Label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. They say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. Adaptation. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Come on and liberate some carbon, baby, it's the human way. Pump those electrons and that gasoline. No sweat or hurry, just turn on a machine. We sent an army to the desert to keep this country free. Hey, hey, and to liberate some carbon, baby, for you and me. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Come on and liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. It's the human way. Maybe not forever. Let's hope not.
And now, at this moment, I'm very happy to welcome Juliet Eilperin. Welcome and congratulations, Juliet.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I want to thank Sigma Xi for this wonderful recognition, as well as some of the people who've played an instrumental role in supporting my work. This starts with my family, especially my parents, Sophie Cook and Steve Eilperin, as well as my husband, Andrew Light, and our two children, Milos and Marika. I'm also grateful to the Washington Post, my hometown paper, and the place where I've been proud to work for nearly half my life. Like being a scientist, the most important quality in a reporter is boundless curiosity. The Post has let me explore critical questions since I joined its staff in my 20s, and covering science and the environment has been the most satisfying task I've ever taken on there. Many scientists have shared their insights with me, and I wouldn't have known half of them if it weren't for Nancy Barron, who's bridged the divide between journalists and researchers with aplomb, and also introduced me to Andy Revkin, my competitor and friend, so she gets credit for that. I'm particularly indebted to the wonderful mentors I've had at the Post, including Don Graham, Nils Berzelius, Trish Wilson, Lori Montgomery, Micah Bramwitz, Stephen Ginsberg, Krista Thompson, Cameron Barr, and Marty Barron. Our new executive editor, Sally Busby, has made climate change a top priority for the paper, which has made a huge difference in our coverage. And finally, I'm so grateful to the other reporters and colleagues I've worked alongside, the smartest and most generous people I know, including the original 5 on the climate and environment team who pioneered our series on what parts of the globe have already warmed by 2 degrees Celsius, and the incredible graphics and photo team who collaborated with us on that project and continue to do so. We have welcomed even more people into our hearty band since then, and they have made my job an absolute joy. Thank you so much for this.
Great, Juliet. Thank you. And as you know, the theme of this conference is Fruits to Roots, Responsible Researchers for a Flourishing Humanity, How Science Virtues Serve Society. And the first thing you mentioned was your curiosity and how that relates to science. And curiosity is one of the virtues or values of science that emerged from recent research conducted by our president, Dr. Robert Pennock. I want to start talking about this award for you. And it's clear that there's a synergy between the scientific community and the journalistic community that has emerged, especially recently. Journalists rely on scientists to provide accurate and reliable information about the universe, and scientists rely on journalists to inform the public about what research tells us. And this honorary membership speaks to the honesty and the objective way that you approach your work. So how does it feel to be recognized by a scientific society for your work?
Oh, I mean, it's incredible. One of the things that I feel is that I have learned a tremendous amount since I really started, roughly a decade and a half ago, focusing on the environment. And again, we couldn't do what we do every day if we didn't rely on the research that's being performed. And frankly, on the ability to really get to the bottom of what we're doing and making sure that we're getting it right. And so while I care about what all of our readers think about our work, I, of course, particularly care about what scientists think about how we are, again, kind of taking what they're learning about the world and conveying it in a way to a broader audience. And so to get this recognition is an affirmation that some of the work that we're doing really is conveying both accurately and with impact what is happening in this world through the scientific lens.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's the right relationship between science and journalism. And before we go directly into your climate communications background and what you've done, I'd like for our audience to understand a little bit about your background and how you came to be a journalist and then ultimately an environmental journalist.
Sure. Well, the quick answer I always give is that they were actually giving out high quality ice cream at the college newspaper during orientation, and that is actually true. I had done journalism on my high school paper, but it was kind of something I did on the side. And the reason I became so engaged after, again, showing up for the high quality ice cream was because I found it was the easiest way to find out exactly how people in positions of power were making decisions that affected my life and the life of other students at Princeton University, where I was an undergrad. And so by doing reporting, I was able to delve into all these different questions. Some had to do with academic freedom. It was everything from, kind of what was happening with students' lives, sexual harassment, you name it. And it is one of these funny things that you have this little notebook and a pen. And in fact, you walk around often without a press pass and you can ask people anything you want and find out what's happening. And again, ultimately hold them accountable. And that just became a driving force in my life and in my work. And so then I continued it. And again, one of the interesting things is from someone who comes born and bred in Washington, D.C., I was very interested in how politicians and policymakers made decisions and started writing about how they made decisions about science and the environment in the context of when I was covering Congress for the Washington Post. And then over time, I decided I wanted to do something slightly different, which is when I switched to covering the environment. And there, what I found, in fact, really enjoyable is that I was able to do real substance, and whether it was both policy, but also the science itself. And that allowed me to kind of get away from the horse race political coverage, which sometimes is something that you find yourself in when you're constantly writing about who's winning and who's losing.
Yeah, I do understand that horse race. You're trying to keep up and stay on top of everything and be the first when you can. And it's a tough job. But among your honors and awards, most recently you've received the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Explanatory Reporting. You've also received the 2020 Society of Environmental Journalists Outstanding Explanatory Reporting Award. And in 2011, you received the Peter Benchley Ocean Award for Media. And, the reporting that led to the Pulitzer Prize was the first time climate reporting, as far as I know, was recognized at this level. And I know that was a result of a tremendous effort and a lot of resources from the Washington Post to cover the climate change on many, many fronts. So could you talk a little bit more about that work and what was involved in bringing that together?
Sure. And, I always say that, one thing, it was an extraordinarily collaborative effort. As you mentioned, it was in many ways the brainchild of my colleague, Chris Mooney, who also is a journalist, a reporter at the Post, and one of our data graphic reporters, John Meiskens, who is just incredible in doing mapping and data analysis. And, we had decided, after writing so much about this tipping point that obviously the UN Climate Summit is grappling with right now of 2 degrees Celsius, the idea that, the world is committed to keeping global average temperature rise to 2 degrees C or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. We thought about how could you show the places that we're kind of living in the future now. And so we all had thought that this was an interesting idea, but it was really, they were able to work together to do the data analysis. Again, working with scientists who shared with us we obviously looked at NOAA and NASA and other data sets, but we also, asked some researchers to guide us in this, to basically look at these places. And then we, under the auspices of Trish Wilson, our editor, we just divvied up the world and basically looked at it. For example, I had done tons of reporting on Alaska, so it was very important to me to go to the North Slope, which is the fastest warming place in the United States, and also ground zero for oil and gas exploration. And then we went through and, figured out other places to go and teamed up with a core set of photographers who were dedicated to this project, as well as some, a couple of other folks on graphics and some foreign correspondents to make sure we could really capture these places. And we really felt that it helped convey what was going on with climate change in a way that wasn't abstract and that could connect with people in a way that we thought really, really ended up working well.
Yeah, that was great reporting, and just having all that information constantly coming in was really informative about what was happening with climate. On a lighter note, I know that in your trip to Alaska, you had an interesting travel experience. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. We had to travel in a very small plane to get particularly to Shekpuk Lake, which is a fairly remote lake on the North Slope. You have to fly from Barrow, where you can take a commercial flight. So we had to go in a small Cessna. And one of the things that the pilots always do when they meet you to go in a small plane is that they ask for your weight, they size you up to figure out what they're going to do. And they decided in this case, we had a fantastic pilot. I was traveling with Bonnie Jo Mount, a wonderful photographer who I've traveled to many places with. And he looked at us and basically decided that I could go in the luggage compartment in the very back and that I could squeeze in there. Whereas Bonnie Jo, who of course took priority because she needed to take photos as we were flying and captured some incredible wildlife. She got the best seat, and having been used to being scrunched in the back of the car by my brother, I was perfectly comfortable being squeezed in with our luggage and all work.
Well, you'll do anything to get the story, right?
Exactly.
That's great. Writing about climate change is actually a challenge because people are so passionate about the environment. And sometimes we hear that environmental scientists, as well as journalists, are being categorized as activists simply for communicating facts about climate change. So how do you explain the differences between environmental journalism and activism? And how do we protect ourselves from these accusations of activists?
It is a tough thing, and I am very comfortable being, kind of a more traditional mainstream journalist. And so what I always say is that a friend a long time ago said to me that life is full of choices, and that is how I approach the news and the information that I'm conveying. That it's not my job to tell you what should happen in terms of policy or action, and that's something that, again, everyone needs to decide for themselves. What I want to do is be as honest as possible about what are the choices and the ramifications of the decisions that we make, whether it's as individuals, as a nation, as the ramifications of corporations, you name it. And so I really feel like that is, while sometimes people, including environmentalists, think that we should be their allies and we should go bend over backwards to kind of portray what they're saying. And that's not our job either. I feel, and I think, for scientists, I think in some ways it's extremely complicated because they are often both conveying their findings, but are being asked what to do. And that is a very difficult line, which, I have a lot of empathy for. But I think in terms of the work that we do, if we are as clear as possible about what the facts are, and also, again, what happens depending on what choices we make, then that's the best way that we can convey what's at stake without crossing that line of being advocates.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of what to do, I know right now, as we speak, the UN Climate Conference is happening, COP26 in Glasgow. And I know you have your eyes on it. You probably have an article coming out very soon on what's happening there. What are you hearing? What can you share with us as news? And is there a reason for optimism from that conference?
Well, that's an interesting question. I know.
Questions.
So I'd say a couple of different things. I'd start by saying I actually think people have been, most people I think have been struck by the fact that it has been more substantive in its first few days than people had anticipated. There have been these very big pledges that have been made, including the fact that more than 100 nations, accounting for 85% of the world's forests, have pledged to end deforestation by 2030. And the fact that you have roughly 100 nations pledging to cut methane emissions, obviously that's a very potent greenhouse gas, by 30% by the end of the decade. Now, again, many of these pledges have been made in the past and they have not been followed through on. So, countries have not delivered on many of these commitments. And that is one of the things that we at the Washington Post have been scrutinizing and will continue to scrutinize. So I think the skepticism certainly comes in both with the fact that, we have to see to what extent the nations will deliver on what they're saying, and as well as corporations. But it has been interesting to see that. And then, of course, the other really important thing is the fact that the leaders of Russia and China decided not to come to the conference. It does obviously signal two of the most significant climate players are not involved. And so I think it's a mixed bag, but it has been interesting to see that there at least has been more movement than I think some people thought would come out of this conference already.
Yeah. And, one of the complicating factors of whatever comes out of the conference and what scientists produce in the lab is this issue of misinformation. So all of the good work that's being done runs into this wall of misinformation. And I'm sure you've observed, especially if you know Nancy Barron, that scientists are now trying to move out there and counter that misinformation. And they're actually behaving very much like journalists in the sense that they're writing blog posts and they're communicating in a variety of ways. Meanwhile, journalists are engaging in more scientific types of activities. Data journalism is essentially data science. So is there a convergence of science and journalism that's happening right now?
I think there is. I think you really hit upon an interesting point for a story that we're publishing within a day or two. We've been joking. My colleagues and I have been consulting in detail with a number of top flight researchers in the United States and overseas. And a couple of them have remarked that basically we're doing PhD work, and I would also argue some of them are doing investigative journalism, and somehow we have managed to end up in the same spot. And I think, that is one of the fascinating, moments that we're in, that there has been a kind of convergence, which frankly, I think wasn't even true a few years ago. But I think that both journalists were trying to answer some questions and felt like at some point we had to do it ourselves. And at the same time, I think that there's been a push by some academics who are involved, especially working on this issue of climate change, that they've started participating in a way that they hadn't before.
Yeah, interesting. And as we broaden the conversation to sort of journalism in general, I think it's a good time to bring Andy in. And so, Andy, I know that you know Juliet very well. Please come in, turn on your mic.
Yeah, hey there.
Hi.
It's great to see you, Juliet.
Of course, awesome to see you.
Yeah, congratulations.
I was gonna say congratulations.
Yeah. So now we have.
I can't tell you how, like, as I've said, I mean, I learned so much by being scooped by Andy and seeing his mastery of the subject when I entered this field, and then had a great time. We've had a great time being with scientists together and working on these things. So I'm thrilled that we could.
But I'll just add that, Juliet literally wrote the book on why Congress is getting so polarized before the most recent uber polarization. So I rely on her reporting and writing and her friendship, to help me navigate that stuff too. So it's just a big, joyful love fest here.
There you go.
Yeah, great. It's great to have both of the honorary members together. Andy, I'm sure you've been listening, and the last question that I put out there was about the convergence that appears to be happening in science and journalism. Do you have any thoughts or anything you'd add to that conversation?
No, I think, I think you've hit on something really important. I was going to tweet what you said there, that science is migrating into newsrooms and scientists are becoming media figures. They're both happening. The one thing about the journalistic adoption of scientific methods in the newsroom, I'm still navigating is, and I did a webcast, one of my Columbia webcasts, about the migration package that ProPublica did. My friend Abram Lustgarten, I used to work at ProPublica, and they got a modeler from Baruch College and others to help them build models. The challenge is the peer review in journalism comes after you publish. You do your internal fact checking, but the history of it is you only rely on the scientists to do certain things. And if you're only relying on a couple of scientists to build a model and you're not doing your own peer review, you can end up oversimplifying things. So it's good stuff. I think that's an issue that has to be navigated still. If it's presented, there was a ton of this on COVID, and some of it was really groundbreaking and fantastic. Columbia, actually, some public health scientists at Columbia worked with the Times on a package on some of that early modeling on COVID-19. But I do think it can lead to some overinterpretations of things. That's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, when I bring the two of you together, you talked about scooping stories. Scoop is also a concept in science where scientists are always racing against one another to get that next breakthrough. But I do wonder, even though you might be covering the same thing, how have you distinguished yourselves from one another in the way that you approach the projects? I mean, I think you both have your own perspectives.
Oh my God, that's a tough question. I mean, right. I think there are different ways. So, one way you distinguish yourself is by finding out what's happened first, right? Or focusing, certainly, I mean, again, we both of us, when I think of the work that, we've both certainly worked on, whether it's identifying, when there's been censorship by government officials, I mean, or, again, new policies that you're trying to, and lobbying around them that you want to expose. Andy we weren't doing the same kind of work during the past administration when I was writing about, say, the corruption of top officials. So there's always that kind of line of coverage. But I think that, anyway, it would be really interesting to hear what Andy says, but I think that, I have, because of the focus of particularly the Washington Post, I've been quite focused on the intersection between policy and the environment and science, whereas sometimes I feel like Andy has and speak for yourself, but obviously has been particularly in recent years focused a little, has obviously played a little more in the pure scientific debate realm in a way that I would say that I probably have spent less time. But
I think the one thing that the one thing I dove into that is, I think, still fairly distinct, not just between me and Juliet or between me and the Post and the Times, was the interrogatory approach I took with my blog. The New York Times in 2007. Actually, I got a Guggenheim Fellowship, and it was going to be, theoretically, it was to step off of the hamster wheel of news to frame out a book on sustainability. But the hamster wheel of news, actually it was 2006, the hamster wheel was spinning really loud. That was right when Jim Hansen was being muzzled, and we were both writing on NASA and NOAA and these issues under the Bush administration. And there was just no way I could break away. And so, and at the same time, I began to realize that the climate problem was a terrible fit for front page stories. That doesn't mean you can't tell great front page stories, as the Post just demonstrated, a year ago. But issues like how dangerous is global warming, or what is adaptation? How do you measure a community's resilience? Or there's countless aspects of this question. Nuclear power. Most people's perceptions of nuclear power are based more on their feelings than facts, on both sides. And so I started to think, none of that fits into a story, but it does fit into a conversation. And .earth, the blog I started, it was, there wasn't some editor who said, "Hey, Andy, we need a climate blog." I felt we needed to have a conversation with readers. And it actually started at the North Pole in 2003, when there was an editor on the web desk, Rebecca de Molin, who, while I was on the sea ice at the North Pole with a satellite phone, she was saying, "Well, let's do a Q&A with readers." I thought, "Oh, that's cool." Otherwise there's nothing in the union contract for reporters that says thou shalt do Q&As with readers. It's go get the story. But I was on the sea ice. I thought, okay, let's do that. And so we just kind of cobbled together a Q&A, and I went to Greenland, and I wrote a big story in Greenland in 2004. But while I was doing it, I was essentially blogging before I was blogging. 2005, I did a podcast from the Montreal Climate Talks. No one said, "Hey, Andy, we need audio," but I was recording audio, like all reporters have their, I thought, hey, these voices are interesting. So that's the thing I think I tried, and I'm still trying now with my sort of more conversational, and now it's more webcasts, and my new column are really about building a community around a question more than telling people the answer to a question.
Yeah, I think, and that's facilitated these days by social media. So there's been this expansion of all the variety of platforms that you can engage your audiences with. I guess the challenges, and one of the things that, that my community of science communicators struggles with is oftentimes you're speaking to the choir. How do you reach beyond the people who are naturally going to be drawn to you because they're science interested? And if we want to reach those audience, what are the tools there?
I think that's a challenge, although, it's any journalist struggles with that. Although I do feel like you can write really compelling stories, and they do, they have a huge impact and can resonate with folks. And it's part of the reason why I think it is so important to travel to these communities. And one of the real advantages we have, again, is when both of us started out in journalism, we were producing content for print papers that, only, had a limited distribution and obviously just didn't have the reach. And so now, while there is this issue of polarization, I do feel like in this moment, particularly where there has been extreme weather worldwide, it has brought in a new audience to the kind of things that we're exploring. And when you couple that with the fact that you have younger people who are more engaged in the issue of climate change than the people who are older than them, we are at a moment where this kind of journalism can reach more and more people.
Yeah. Well, since we have an audience here of scientists, I'm just going to ask this question, and maybe this will be one of our last questions. How do scientists make your jobs easier?
Well, they're wonderful sources of everything we think about. And the one mistake I made early on through my first 18 years on this beat was talking to physical and natural science folks, oceanographers, physicists, modelers. And it took until 2006. Literally the first time I think I interviewed a social scientist on climate change was 2006, when the issue got really hot. And boy, they were telling me some real cold shower stuff, that for any journalist is almost like existential, because, Dan Kahane at Yale and Robert Brule and others were saying, most of the time people look at information with a cultural lens, and no matter what you write, they're going to interpret it a different way. Or cultural cognition, is devastating, really.
Yeah.
Because it says I could be a great reporter for the rest of my life and it's not going to change things. But it's also incredibly valuable, because then you understand that not everything is a function of machinations in Washington. Sometimes it's a function of how someone grew up, their culture, they're aligned with, and that leads to lots of really cool stories too. So science, all these sciences together have informed the way I look at the world as a journalist. If I hadn't had that grounding, just to cut to the chase, scientists and journalists share a zeal for knowing how the world really works. And part of that is taking apart, making sure you're aware of your own biases, your own predispositions, your own narrative, and working really hard to get that out of the equation. And if I hadn't talked to all the scientists I've known through my life, some of whom still live in my head, even though they're dead, like Steve Schneider, literally.
Yeah.
He talks to me almost every week. I would still be like flailing around.
Yeah, I think that, Andy was absolutely, I think, in the vanguard of really helping popularize this understanding that social scientists were finding about climate change, which was really important. I would also say that I still love hanging out with marine biologists and getting in the water and spending time with sharks. So there's always that upside. And I can't wait for our upcoming story to come out so I can send you our methodology and show you how we peer reviewed what we did before it got published. So, again, they're just, there are, I think scientists in many ways are our lodestar. They're the way we make sure that we're doing things right. And we can do that because we have generally a relationship of mutual respect and understanding, and this commitment, as Andy said, to getting to the truth. And I think if you have that, it really allows you to push the envelope in what you're doing journalistically and in terms of your research that still has integrity. And that's the foundation of what we do. And so with that, our work doesn't have meaning.
Wow. Well, I think that's a great place to end the conversation. I want to thank you for being with us today. This conversation is indicative of why you were selected to be honorary members this year. It's clear that you approach your work the way I think many of our members approach their work. And I am very appreciative to have you here today. And I hope you'll stick around. We're going to be doing the induction ceremony with the student award winners in the next hour. And thank you. Thank you, everyone.